I do this fun thing where I do talks and some hundreds, a couple thousand people sometimes, and I'll say, right, everyone touch your knees, and I'll touch my elbows, and I'll say, everyone touch your knees, and everyone will touch their elbows because they don't listen to the words, they listen to the body, right? You get it? So it's also like, this is what we know. This is how we flirt. This is how we make each other laugh.
Aside from my soul. Welcome to the Inspired Evolution. And it is an embodied treat for us to be here today. We have with us Mark Walsh. Mark, how are you there, brother?
Pleasure to be here. I liked your intro there. That was fun. I never thought anyone do that before. So I'm already happy. I've realized... We should apologize for on YouTube for the 1980s time warp, which seems to be my background. The Airbnb I'm in, and somehow I didn't kind of coordinate the Airbnb with my shirt, so it's off to already.
We're going back to the future, is what you're saying, mate. You look great. I really appreciate having you here today. For those that are tuning into Mark for the first time, man. It's I don't want to say it's tough to do the honors, but there's a lot in here. Background in psychology, training in facilitation for leading organizations. We're looking at Shell, IKEA, Virgin Atlantic, L'Oreal. He's taught embodiment work in over 30 different countries. He's done numerous keynotes on the topic. He's got a background with, I think it's 20 plus years of aikido training now. There's a lot that you've been up to in the world, but go check out his Instagram. He is Mr Embodiment. And I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today, Mark. Now, the key thing where I wanted to sort of start was, do you ever look back at the version of yourself that was like 10 or 12 and go, that's why I'm Mr. Embodiment today. Like, what was that kid like that is now Mr. Embodiment in 2022?
Yeah, when I interview people, I've started asking, what deep childhood trauma led you to do what you do now? And almost as a joke, and so many people are answering that. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a screwed up family where everyone was crazy, and I grew up in an alcoholic family, so that was definitely an influence there. And also I was kind of bright as a kid cognitively.
Yeah.
And school was really easy for me, despite, stuff going on at home. And what I realized was like, hey, I was reading all these books, I was speed reading and just going through it, and it wasn't helping. By 12, 13, I was suicidal, alcoholic a few years later. And by the time I went to university, where people said, hey, this is the peak, you go to school, you go to sixth form, you go to uni. And I was like, well, something else has got to be going on. And I think it came from that childhood of just, from a family of teachers, but a pretty screwed up one. And thinking, well, there must be something more than just having a big brain and reading lots of books.
I find that really interesting because, there's a few pieces in there in terms of, I think from this point, understanding what embodiment really is, because, I think not everybody's had trouble in childhoods, but there's definitely something that sort of lets the light in, as Rumi puts it. The cracks are where the light gets in, and everybody has that in their childhood a little bit. Not to belittle what you've gone through, and to sort of say, what does embodiment mean to you then, in terms of how do you find those two things stitching in together? So that challenges that you've had, what does embodiment mean, and how is that the antidote to some of the stuff that you've gone through?
You could look at that childhood situation I was in as a microcosm of the macrocosm of the world now. So, mental health issues, relational issues, addiction issues, that sounds like whatever you see when you walk out the door in, London, Melbourne, New York, wherever.
Yeah.
But at the same time, hypercognitive, super clever, reading a lot, lots of information. And somehow Wikipedia hasn't solved the world's problems any more than the Encyclopedia Britannica did when I was 12. So I think it's a microcosm of a macrocosm there, which is kind of like, I got into it. I studied through the martial arts, so, moved to yoga, conscious dance, body therapy, trauma work, all this stuff I do now, you know, right through to training coaches and being in Ukraine this year, you know, the whole story of it. It's the thread is like, well, thinking ain't going to get us out of this mess.
And so is that what you're alluding to in terms of you were super intelligent growing up, obviously cognitive and, you know, doing well at school and all that. However, you found that there were still all these challenges, emotional challenges, mental health challenges that were present for you, and embodiment sort of presented itself as a different type of intelligence.
Yeah, so I think there's lots of definitions of embodiment. One I like is a type of intelligence. You know, I actually break it down into having sort of 8 different skill sets within that, 4 main ones. And we can get smarter at that. So, for example, when I first walked into an aikido school, I thought I was pretty smart, but it turned out I was actually pretty dumb in a lot of ways. And I'd already been proving that with my chosen lifestyles. So, you know, in terms of addiction and things like this. So I realized that the types of intelligence I was most interested in, emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, intuitive intelligence, relational intelligence, I realized that really these are all subsets of embodied intelligence. That our body is not just a piece of meat. You know, I thought the body is just something that carried my head around from class to class in school.
Isn't it?
Professor friend of mine said, I'm not. Get in there a little bit. Yeah. So I realized there was a whole other way to be smart, and I wanted in on that because I was rubbish at it first. You know, like I remember being an absolute, you know, really struggling with that first Aikido class. And then quickly realizing like, hey, this is giving me a lot of benefits in my life. This is giving me practical tools. This is connecting me to myself more abstractly. I remember kind of going, okay, so what do I do when I'm stressed? Can I think my way out of it? Probably not. Can I do a quick breathing exercise? Sure. I just learned that. That's easy. You know, when I was teaching someone yesterday as a coach, and she's like, well, how do I explain this to other coaches? You know, and I said, well, it's a shortcut. It's a way to change your state. It's a way to bring awareness to who you are. It's a way to tune into empathy for other people. And, you know, if you're interested in leadership and that narrative, it's definitely part of that.
Yeah. So is it, because it does, when I hear the word embodiment, it does have connotations of physiology. Is it coming back into harnessing the intelligence of your physiology? Is that really what it's, if I had to make it succinct, is that what we're coming back to?
Sometimes I say coming home to the body. I like the sort of bit slightly poetic version of that. When we think physiology, we still think object, right? Like you go to the doctor and maybe they draw blood, or they do a blood pressure test, or they do a scan. So you can look at the body as an object. However, your body is fundamentally different than a chair, right? Like when you touch someone's arm, they say you're touching them. I mean, why are you touching my arm, we'd say, right? But we don't mean my arm like I mean my pen. We understand that the body is part of us. So sometimes the field is described as the subjective study of the body. Right. And that just means the body is an aspect of who we are, which is sort of common sense, right? Like a kid actually gets that. A dog gets that. If there's a reason, you know, things like consent exist with bodies and not so much with chairs. The body is ethical. You know, this is in a way just obvious, but then you can study it and get more in detail and develop.
Yeah, no, I think it's a useful conversation.
Yeah. So another category, another way of talking about it sometimes is just as a field of study that brings together the body, mind, arts. So we kind of need some kind of a word like yoga. Well, it's about awareness, but so is martial arts. And they're not just about physicality, right? Not just about exercise. There's some sense that we're developing ourselves through these arts, what the Japanese would call a do, like aikido or karate do or judo. That concept, we develop ourselves through the body because it's one of the most accessible ways to develop ourselves. And not just physically, though there's nothing wrong with that. You know, you could do some pull-ups and get some bigger biceps or something, right? But in the embodied arts, whether that be, you know, everything from improv comedy to body psychotherapy, we're developing ourselves as people through the body. And that differentiates it from physical exercise, for example.
Yeah, it's interesting because you also mentioned that the this development through the body is linked into some of these other intelligence that you referred to, which was emotional, intuitive, spiritual. Can you explain that link? Because I don't think that's as intuitive for people that are tuning in.
Okay, so emotional intelligence, super important for our happiness, super important for career success. You know, studies on this in various places. How do you know you're having an emotion? right? Well, it's in the body. You need body awareness. So body awareness is one of the key foundations of embodiment.
I've heard people say this, and they usually try and get you to isolate where the emotion is in your body. Can you describe that? Is that a process that you go through? Like, is that, it's like, okay, I'm feeling angry. Like, do you tune in and go, where am I feeling this in my body? Is that a question?
So I actually asked the question, how are you doing that? So this comes from one of my teachers, Paul Linden. So if someone says I'm angry, I'm like, well, how are you doing that? Because there's a way in which you are making anger, you're constructing it, right? Like,
Right.
By being angry while soft and open and leaning back, it's very difficult to do. Try being depressed while you're doing star jumps, or try being depressed while traveling. Right. So now emotion is a little bit more than that, because there's a sort of emergent kind of gestalt quality to it. So it's not just reducible to, yes, when you're angry, your eyes are tight, your jaw is tense, your belly is tense, your breath may be more shallow and in the chest. We could go for every body part and look at how anger is generally done, though we need to be careful, because what you're calling anger, I might call rage. What I call rage, you might call fierceness. So that the label that's put on that, we may be talking about different things.
Right.
What we can say is this more or less useful? So looking at that fight-flight response, there's not many times I think, what would have really helped last night when I had that difficult conversation with my wife about whether we're going to live in Portugal or not. If I'd have been more annoyed and angry, that would have been really Now, there are instances where anger can get people out of depression and powerlessness. Also, it's telling me something, right? So if I'm angry, I want to get the message. It's like the bell's ringing. Like, why am I angry? Well, something's being violated. Some of my values is being crossed here.
Yeah.
And so it's useful to, to emotional intelligence to feel that, get the message, but then also maybe to regulate it. So there's the emotional awareness, but there's emotional regulation. Now, everyone can do that to an extent, because we're not toddlers, right? Like, I was at a pretty cool, fun hippie dance party last night where everyone was screaming and shouting, but that was a choice to be expressive. All those people have the ability to, they're not 2-year-olds who throw themselves on the floor in the supermarket when they don't get some sweets or something. So like self-regulation would be that's one of the main things I teach leaders, I teach coaches. When coaches are working with a client, I don't know about you, but I know you coach as well, like 9 out of 10 times my client turns up and they are what's technically known as all fucked up.
Frazzled.
Like they're frazzled, they're stressed, they're anxious, they're over busy. So the first thing I'm like, okay, Amrit, John, whatever, put your feet on the floor, like you did before this interview, which was so nice to see. And by the way, I've been interviewed many times. The first time I've seen a host actually do what I would call centering before an interview. Like, you want to be in your best place, right? Like you're doing a podcast, you want to be in a good spot. Or like, we had a bit of a problem with the Wi-Fi before, and I started to go, that panic started to set in. And, oh my God, I want to do this interview. What the hell's going on? Is it my Wi-Fi? And then just, all right, let's probably nothing. Let's just wait 5 minutes. It'll be fine.
Yeah, thank you for that reflection. I often do wonder how kooky I come across for the guests.
I love how you come across it. That's embodied, right? The Amritness. Like, I don't know you. I've just listened to a couple of podcasts. I've met you, but your personality is embodied.
Oh, touch wood. Thank you for that kind reflection. My wife would say kooky.
Everyone, right? And this is where we come to leadership or empathy. Like, I'm receiving that from you. I'm feeling that. Like, I'm being upregulated, and you kind of bring, like, it's kind of late here in Portugal. And it's actually really nice to be with someone who's kind of like, okay, it's fun. And it, makes me upbeat, keeps me awake. And then it's like leadership as well. It's like, well, how do I want to influence people? Because that's through the body.
Yeah, so there's this really interesting concept that's come to me recently, which is, and it's something I've been trying to, I have been articulating it from stage in talks before, and I love it. There's only a few audiences where I've been able to really drop in and sort of speak to that. And ironically, it comes up usually at the sales part of like the conversation, which, anyway, I'm digressing into too deeply into context. But there's this concept of, I don't know if the word harage means anything to you, but it's this word, and I think it's from the Japanese culture. I might be completely wrong, in which case, please pardon me. But I came across it recently, and it talks about how it defines basically the concept behind the word is like the communication that's coming through beyond the words and potentially beyond even the body. It's more state communicating to you, your state communicating to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're smiling. Tell me more about what's firing in your head.
Man. That's what we're doing all the time. Like I do this fun thing where I do talks and some hundreds, a couple thousand people sometimes. And I'll say, right, everyone touch your knees and I'll touch my elbows.
Yeah.
And I'll say, everyone touch your knees and everyone will touch their elbows because they don't listen to the words. They listen to the body.
Yeah.
Right. You get it? So it's also like, this is what we know. This is how we flirt. This is how we make each other laugh. You know, like I was on a train and there was two kids there and they met each other and one spoke Russian and one spoke Ukrainian. And they tried to speak to each other, but they couldn't understand each other because those languages, you know, pretty different. And then they just started playing and they just ran off being happy playing together. Like, no problem. Like that's instinctive. You know, a dog knows if it's dominant or you want to play or you're scared.
Yeah.
Like that's an instinctive, and it's going on for human beings. And as coaches, like how we impact people, how we leave them feeling, this is just huge. It's just huge. The words is just the top little bit.
Yeah, I think that's the really interesting part of it. The way I was describing it before I had the word harage was, you know, and I used to say in my sales stories, like, I know all the sales tactics. I know if I get you to raise your hand, your hand's already up, you've already got one yes. If I get you to stand up, that's a second yes. If I get you to move to the back of the room, that's a third yes, and you're in. You know, like I've done all those trainings, and oh my God, part of me hates them. And then there's that honest truth in me, which is like, part of me hates it. And so I literally just stand up there and I go, look, guys, I could totally do that to you, but if coaching's for you, it's for you. If it's not, it's not for you. And this is probably the worst sales pitch ever. But if I came to you from any other place, in your Bluetooth, infrared, Wi-Fi frequencies of your human awareness, you can pick up on the fact that I'm trying to do something sleazy that's not aligned with me. So I'm not even going to bother. You know, I'm just going to do me.
People are smart. People feel it.
And we don't give them credit for that. We don't give them credit for that, right? Like their intuitive systems actually really know.
Like people ask, you know, what's the best chart line? And it's like, hello. You know, like I like your face. What's your name? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like that's it. Yeah. So yeah, for sure. People feel when there's manipulation. They feel when there's aggression. And you know, we've got to be careful with that because there's also prejudices, there's trauma, you know, there's other things kind of in that mix. But we, you know, we do have a wisdom there.
But then also to take that conversation further, you just mentioned like being, I'll use your word, centering, or being centered or being embodied, helps you not be in this sort of like vibrating in a place where you're a bit more reactive to said other person's trauma or other person's story, or you're less reactive when you're embodied, would you say?
Yeah, so we're all unconsciously embodied, right? We all have a way of being, which is a pattern, a set of habits, which is held together by how we breathe, move, stand. And that affects how we think, perceive, relate, lead, love, parent, whatever. So we all have that. And what you just said, you could pick apart for a few days, you know, that we're unconsciously embodied and it impacts all these areas. However, we can become consciously embodied. So we can start actually feeling how we are. So you're not the guy who's saying, I'm not angry. You're like, dude, you kind of look angry, you sound angry, you're acting angry, you're about to punch me. So, you know, so we can build some self-awareness of state and trait. Trait's invisible, right? State you can feel. That's emotion, like, oh, I'm a bit tired, or hey, I'm enjoying this interview with Joanne. Trait is like, that's like your underpants that you can't feel anymore because they're comfortable, or the taste of your own mouth. You know, that takes another set of embodiment techniques to become aware of that. And once we're aware of those things, we can change them. Like state's really easy to change. Trait takes practice and time, right? It takes a discipline. Now, in terms of like agitation, so fight, flight response, you know, many listeners I'm sure have heard of, pretty common to talk about stress, suffering, the Buddha called it. There's lots of ways to talk about it. And that's just often not very helpful. Now, you can sell, let's go back to your sales example. You can sell to people by making them scared. Right, buy this bleach or your kids will die. You know, you know, if you have dandruff, then everyone will hate you and you won't ever get love. Or you can sell to people by making them more and more relaxed, more and more connected, and then actually going, is this like a good fit for you genuinely? and the return rate's going to be a lot less on that second one. So yeah, you can trick people to getting anxious and going to the back of the room and, you know, doing all that stuff, but you'll have a lot of refunds needed the next day. Right. Yeah. So my friend Ted Hargrave, for example, he does marketing for hippies, a really cool guy. You know, we together kind of, while he was interviewing me, had this idea of like trauma sensitive marketing, like doing marketing, which isn't trying to make people more anxious. And as a leader, that's one of the main things we do. Like, so I'm teaching some trauma work in Ukraine a few months ago.
Tell us more about it.
And there's a bunch of people, like 100 people in the room, day one of the training, a couple of hours have gone by, it's going well, you know, teaching them about this topic they really want to learn about. It's fun, actually, a lot of good friends there. My wife's Ukrainian, so, you know, well connected, doing the training. And then there's an alarm, air alarm. So that means Russian rocket attack, basically. And everyone immediately goes, oh, they hold their breath, their anxiety comes up, their eyebrows come up, they start looking around. And I'm in the front of the room, and then they look to me, right? Now I'm scared too, right? Because, you know, I've been in a few war zones, but this not for a while, and it's scary the first time in a while. So I just put my feet on the ground, standing there at the front, bent my knees slightly, took a breath and said, okay, guys, take a breath. We know where the bomb shelter is. We've got 3 minutes. Let's walk there. No one's going to get hurt in a stampede. We take our time. We'll be there in 3 minutes easy. Yeah. And you could see the group just trust me more. It's like, okay, this guy's worth listening to. Yeah. And that is this. Imagine you got an aeroplane and the pilot was like, hello, welcome to Qantas, and, you know, you're on board. You'd be like, yeah, maybe I'll get another flight, you know, like it doesn't trust.
Yeah. And so I love that example, because it's about being calm, controlled, centered. Do you think more and more leaders are tuning into the conversation of how important this is for them? Obviously, your work is thriving.
Yeah, I mean, mindfulness and emotional intelligence have really opened up the door.
Yeah.
So, you know, if mindfulness is awareness and embodiment's awareness and choice, then it's great. It's built on that. My job has got so much easier. You know, first started teaching corporates 15 or 16 years ago. And I'd walk in, and I'd, teach them to meditate, and they'd look at me like I was crazy hippie, you know. Now they've all got an app and they've done it before. And I know that already. They might have missed the point, but at least they're pretty open to it. It's like, John Kabat-Zinn, God bless him, opened up the door, and so many others. And I think they get the emotional intelligence. You know, they get in business that the guy with the MBA from Oxford or whatever isn't the best leader. They get that he might, or, a common one I get is that someone's got technical skills as a banker, lawyer, doctor, whatever. They get promoted, and all of a sudden they're managing people, and there's a whole skill set they just don't have.
Yeah.
Right. And they're in a tough position. I've got these guys in a room, and they're like, why don't people listen to me?
Super competent.
Yeah. They've got another set of competencies that got them there, and then they need this management or leadership competencies. So that's a pretty common one.
Okay, so let's go there, because now we're talking about some of the softer skills that are in these leadership environments. And the key one that's circulating for me in this conversation, or that's bubbling up, is the word trust. And I think those are some of the things that are much more difficult to train. It's like, how do you build trust with others? Now, there are 100+1 sleazy tactics that you can do that. But then there's also, like in this conversation, I think honoring the conversation and, what's available to us is, how do you leverage embodiment training, or how do you utilize embodiment training to learn to trust yourself better?
To learn to trust yourself.
Yeah, so that then you can encourage others to trust you, because I'm sure that's there's a real link there that people can sort of, listening to this podcast, you're a certain type of audience, you know what we're talking about. Like, if you can trust yourself, that frequency is then what you put out, right? And then people will be able to trust you better. And you can, like, leadership is, yes, competency, but also completely all about trust as well. I'm hoping that people are aware of that dyad as well.
Yeah, I mean, leadership in terms of trust is about maybe 3 things: competence, reliability, sincerity.
Right.
So what people talk about trust, talking about several things, and then self and other, as you point out. So in terms of reliability, that's just built over time by doing what you say, right? Like, my wife trusts me to do certain things and try not to do other things, because it's like, I'm not a very good cook, and she's had a few meals with me, and maybe it's like she doesn't trust me to cook. I'm not, she knows I'm unreliable as a cook, but I'm reliable in other ways. like I'm generally on time for stuff, but like that's just over time you develop a reputation with others or with yourself, right? And then sincerity is like, okay, does this person really mean it? And for me, that's not about like tricking someone into, fake signals of congruence. It's about actually tuning in to myself and being, do I really mean it? Do I really mean what I say it? Yeah. And competence to some extent is signaled by relaxation. So why am I competent teaching embodiment? Because I've done it for years, tens of thousands of hours. Why am I not competent driving a car? Just because I'm not very good at it, and I'm, haven't had much practice lately. And so I'm more relaxed while teaching embodiment than I am driving a car. Now I can use tricks and tools like centering to help me be more relaxed driving a car. But the signaling of competence is from that relaxation. And you can tell that, like the top gangster is always the one sitting down eating an apple while everybody else is running around stressed out. The top business guy is the one who's just sitting relaxed, and then he maybe says something that's, she says something that's impactful. So I think trust's a few of those things. But if we're not able to tune into ourselves, how do we have any congruence? How do we have any sincerity?
And you mentioned tuning into ourselves is mostly state and trait. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, so state would be like being aware of more of your body in more detail, more of the time. Like we could define that rigorously, right? So, you can be more or less mindful and more or less deeply and more or less consistently, right? Like that's the thing you can get better at. Like I can tell by just being around you, you've done a bunch of practice of mindfulness, and you're present to some degree. I get interviewed by people that are up here in their heads, and it's a whole nother experience. And then there's trait, right, which we've become aware of usually through feedback or through contrasts. I have poses. I get people with like taking up space pose I was working with today with someone that was lacking confidence. And the first time they did it, they're just like, I hate this. This feels wrong. And I'm like, yeah, because you're not used to driving on this side of the road. This is a new thing for you. You're trying on someone else's underpants right now. No. So we have a no pose. I teach boundaries a lot when I'm teaching coaches.
What's no pose?
A no pose. It's like a karate pose.
Yeah.
And looking at the room I've got here, like people can YouTube search it. A beautiful Ukrainian demonstrating it. But let's put self view on just so I can see myself for the YouTube people, and I'll talk it through for the podcast people. So this is a version of no pose we use. You can't see the base, which is like karate legs, like strong, wide stance. Now, if someone has that feeling in their body, they can embody no. We all know how to, but if someone's got this feeling in their body, hi,
no,
I'm really nice. I saw yes to everything. Then it doesn't matter. Like you can teach them a seminar and they can read the book on the power of no, and you can do all this stuff with them.
Yeah.
But they don't embody it. So they need to practice. They need to find that either through something like martial arts or through a pose or through physical practices. I have people doing push-ups and practicing that push away, like chaturanga in yoga. That's chaturanga in yoga is a no. So push away, push the planet. Yeah. So it's in there. It's in these traditional embodied practices, but unless you've got 10 years and a lot of patience, you might not. I can draw it out for people a lot quicker.
Yeah. So I get state, and you said trait is way more finicky.
Well, trait's always happening, but we're the ones who don't feel it. Everyone else, it's like the smell of your own crap. Everyone else smells it.
Oh man, it does smell pretty bad, doesn't it? It does smell pretty bad, doesn't it?
Unless you've had a dodgy curry. I shouldn't have said that analogy. I'm regretting that. I'm getting ossified. Let's say it's like the smell of your own house. Let's have that analogy. You don't smell your own house until you go on holiday, right?
Yeah.
So so I went away there. Then I came back to Brighton, where I've been living, and it's by the sea. And I was like, this house is moldy. It's damp. And I'm like, oh, it's always damp. Look how damp houses where I come from. And it's like, but I wasn't aware of that until I came back from a dry country. So traits like that, we have to kind of step out of it by doing, we do like 4 elements of practice, or we'll do a few different like yes pose and no pose and say which feels most familiar. And sometimes people say it depends because we're always embodied in relationship. I'm embodied differently from you than my wife. We're embodied in context. You know, it's 9 o'clock at night. I'm in Portugal. There's a cultural context. People say I'm more relaxed in Portugal than when I'm in New York, right?
Yeah,
We're embodied in place.
Wonder why.
Right. The embodiment's around you, you're absorbing it. But we also have our own personal patterns. So embodiment includes this cultural element, you know, having taught all over the world. I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah.
It includes relational, like with different embodiments with different people. Like I see my niece and I'm just immediately like getting down to play, you know, like, yeah, I'm cool, Uncle Mark, it's fun, you know, it's just comes straight out. Whereas if you did that with my corporate clients, they might think I was a bit weird. So,
yeah,
you know, all this is going on. The trait part is sort of invisible until we bring it out. Yeah. And then you're like, oh, that's the impact I'm having on everyone.
Right.
You know, I've literally had managers sit down and be like, why is everyone scared of me in this company? What's their problem? And I'm like, well, can I mirror back to you how you're speaking right now? Right? Like that's another way we can do it. We have people copy each other's walks, for example. And you see your walk and you just cringe. It's like, you know, when you first started doing YouTube, Amrit, I don't know if you remember, but did you like hear your own voice for the first time?
Oh man, this is a game that I love to hate playing. Which is, I go back to my first episode and I look at it and I listen to it again and again. Actually, more than I don't know how many people do this, but I go back and I listen and I use it as an inspirational tool actually for me. Because man, that episode was just like crawling out of the frame. It's just like
you've grown, right? Like I'm imagining you're way more relaxed now, way more authentic.
Way more relaxed. Yeah. And so you get to do a lot more of the talking, even though I'm talking over you right now. I took like 20 minutes to ask a question, man. It was so bad. Not so bad, but it was different. I was learning. I was starting something. Yeah. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's very different to when you're starting out.
You were learning. Yeah, we all have to. And it's fun when you look back, but the self-awareness gap is what I was pointing to there. That often there's a gap between our perception of ourselves and the reality of it. Like in my head, I sound like a British Harrison Ford, right? In reality, not so much, you know? So it's do you see what I mean? So like bridging that gap of perception, because we all just feel normal. You could be super fiery or super watery, super passive, super aggressive, whatever. And you would just feel normal because you are used to that embodiment because you've been in it since your childhood patterns constructed it along with your culture when you were a kid. Right.
And so this is trait. So trait is a lot of the stuff that we inherit. Well, inherit makes it sound like it's actually an inheritance, which maybe that's where it comes from. But we inherently carry that we're not even aware of. I like the example you gave of like the taste of the inside of my own mouth. You're sort of just, completely oblivious to that one. But it is, you know, and I like the example of what your home smells like, because you're absolutely right. I come home and it's like, I just went from outside to inside, but I know when I go to someone else's home, I'm like, they cook something that I don't cook, you know, or they do something that I don't do, or these guys are like aromatherapy. I'm going to get some of this going in my life, you know? So there's always that, always that tuning in. And I like how you articulate, because even as you mentioned the mirroring piece, like getting people to mirror each other's walks, there's just, I can see how much would open up in that, because it's like, oh, I don't do that. And it's like, actually, yeah, you do. That'd be really interesting.
Which is another embodiment teacher. I think it's Stuart Heller who says we walk through space like we walk through life, right? Or we stand as we are would be another version of that same thing. Now we've got to be careful with that, because people might, you know, I'm not saying that if someone's got a disability or they've got a funny leg because they fell off their bike yesterday or whatever, it's not about that. It's not about if you're tall or short or this or that. It's how you carry yourself. And we have an intuitive sense of that, but then again, it becomes invisible, but we can develop it. You know, my students work a lot with practices. So yes, you can change state. You could learn, you know, we have centering videos on centering and that kind of thing. Quick wins, good to teach on a short course. But, you know, I love to work with students over time. I mentor people over 2 years. Just got off the phone just a few hours ago to an Austrian mentee of mine, and I've been working with her for about a year and just talking about her aikido practice, and you know, she's going to shift to karate because she wants something a bit more aggressive, more fiery, you know, and we develop it over time. Meditation is a very good base, but adding a movement practice on top of that is super useful.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And just while we're on the topic of courses and things, where's the best place for people to check out some of your favorite, yeah, like some of the things that are available for you? I know there's Embodied Facilitator, where people can go check
Yeah,
out
probably
more.
the best one is embodimentunlimited.com,
Yep.
embodimentunlimited.com, and free videos there on, showing me coaching people. There's ebooks people can download, some podcasts, Embodiment Podcast, Embodiment Book. If you put the word embodiment into almost anything, something will probably come up. But embodimentunlimited.com is the one with kind of everything on if people want to,
Yeah,
look through some free
awesome.
resources and
We'll add links to all of that in the show notes below. Bro, how do you, maybe this is just one of my pain points, but I'm going to speak to it anyway. Pardon me, audience. Maybe some of you can relate. But when you start talking about state and you start talking about trait, like there's a part of me that goes, oh, okay, like automatically starts to want to go there, obsess with state.
Yeah.
How do you temper that? Because then that's also not serving you, because then you're upregulating your nervous system about trying to downregulate it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is usually a stage people go through when they become hyper self-aware, and that is normally dysregulating. And most people will have there various versions of that in different types of personal growth, where I don't know, you study language, you start doing circling or NVC or something, and then you start speaking weird and it's all a bit awkward. So there's a kind of awkward phase people can go through, and then you sort of learn not to give a shit. Often what I do is I teach clients to focus their attention back on the people they're serving.
Right.
So as a coach, a little bit of my attention's on myself just to check my state. Like, hey, am I too tired for this interview? Or hey, am I, relatively calm right now? However, most of my attention's on my coachee or, the people I'm teaching. Most of it's there, which doesn't leave much space for me to get kind of neurotic and anxious about my own self. And sometimes in that period, people can lose a bit of authenticity. And then normally there's a kind of naturalness on the other side of practice.
Another question I've got is, what are the top three sort of embodiment mistakes that you see people making in not being embodied? Is it just not taking moments to pause? I imagine pausing is probably super vital throughout the day.
Part of the current civilization.
The capitalistic model.
Joking aside,
society.
there's a concept.
He's not joking. He's not joking. He said
I love
Western
society in many ways. I mean, this is the best time to be alive, right? Like I wouldn't have wanted to be born in 1930s or 500 years ago. I have samurai fantasies occasionally, but I don't really want to live in Japan. But I mean, the context we're in is fast, disembodied in the sense of we're in a disembodied age. It's super stressed, super fast, super technological.
Yeah, the devices.
Disconnected from community, disconnected from nature, and with a lack of movement. So if we want to be more embodied, they're the places to look. More nature. Like I did 3 hours of coaching today, walking around the cliff tops on the beach here in Lagos, which is beautiful in Portugal. And that's a way I'm going to do way better coaching than sitting on my laptop kind of thing, So nature, community and connection, touch, relationship, without that we go crazy, as it's been proven the last few years. Not having an embodied practice. Like you could read my book on embodiment, right? Whatever, you could listen to 100 podcasts, but it's better, an ounce of practice is worth a ton of theory.
Right.
Saying that, having a little bit of we've kind of mapped my embodied intelligence model today, which is kind of helpful to have some theory, to know the territory. To have some community around practice is really helpful. My mentees will get together and we have that accountability and feedback. Tech use is one to be a little bit careful of, but I don't want to demonize it either. If you bring movement, nature, community in your life and just be a little cautious with your tech use, you're going to be getting a major upgrade. Like that's a huge plus over the average person.
I love that. The one that's less intuitive in what you've described, because the other ones make sense. I love going for walks in nature. I love a healthy, even just like lying down sometimes for 20 minutes and just stretching out the tight bits in my body, like really connecting into that. It doesn't necessarily have to be yoga. I'm inspired by yin yoga in so many ways. But it just feels so good on the other side. But the community connection, touch, relation piece. Yeah, it's I love it obviously because not obviously, but my highest value is connection, and so I just froth on it. But to hear you say that connection, relationship, it has this sense of other, and when we're talking about embodiment, it has this connotations of self about it, like embodied within the self. And yet you're alluding to how important it is to have others around you that are also embodied within self. Can you describe that dance a little bit in terms of like how other helps
embodiment
you?
allows connection. It's very different. This is, without embodiment, we're psychopathic. Actually, no one's that embodied, no, that disembodied. But the sense of, by connecting to myself, it brings empathy online. It brings connection online. So those two things are intimately linked. They feed back to each other. That's a bi-directional positive feedback loop, right? Like other people help us be embodied, but our embodiment helps us be with other people. And that, for trauma, for example, sometimes people get numb and then they find it difficult to connect, and then the experiences don't go so well, and that can lead to vicious cycles. Yeah, it's one of the definitions of trauma. And then there's the bigger body of the planet, the whole world. So we can almost think of, the body, the communal body, the planetary body, and they're all helpful to connect to. We're just talking about connection, really, at the end of the day.
You mentioned trauma a couple of times in this podcast. Is this part of the work that you help people do, like move through some of that stuff with their bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a trauma educator, not a trauma therapist. So this is part of the education I give all the coaches I work with, for example, because I just feel like they're missing a huge thing if they don't. And then, I've worked in a bunch of places that have had conflict or are having conflict around.
You really have. You've traveled to lots of different places where most people are walking the other way. You're walking into. Have you noticed this, or is this the first time you're hearing someone say this to you?
What's it called? Yeah, I mean, I lived in the slums of Brazil. I lived at a circus in Ethiopia when there was conflict there. Where else? Afghanistan.
You went to Ukraine.
I've been to Ukraine this year twice. I've been to Israel-Palestine 20 times. I mean, I'm drawn.
What is driving you to do that?
What is wrong with you, Mark?
No, not like that. But like, what is driving you to do that?
I think there was unhealthy and healthy drivers. So unhealthy driver when I was young is I had unhealed trauma from my own childhood. And I went to a war zone. I just felt at home. And whether it was a corporate war zone metaphorically or an actual war zone, I just went, oh yeah, this fits my nervous system. Right. I remember going to Israel and being like, finally, people who are running the right speed, because I was kind of hyper aroused. And, now after having done a lot of trauma healing, which is actually very helpful for embodiment, that'd be another top tip to be embodied. Just look at your trauma. There's lots of great embodiment techniques out there for that. Yeah. TRE, somatic experiencing, these loads. Now my motivation's much more, I think, coming from like, hey, because I get this, I have this trust there. I turn up in Ukraine and they're like, you wouldn't get this. And I'm like, yeah, I would. Like I've had trauma personally, and this isn't my first war to be in. And they get that and they go, oh, okay. And then I can teach them. And, actually, I don't sound too heroic in any of this. It's just kind of fun for me, and I wasn't taking unnecessary risks, for example, in Ukraine. It was pretty measured. I wasn't on the front lines. I want to give people that impression. So now I just feel like it's just part of the gift, and it's part of the human experience, sadly, around the world. And if you're going to look at human beings, you have to at least understand trauma, intergenerational trauma, how that's passed on. The world's kind of got a bit obsessed with trauma since I started looking into it. It's become a bit of a fashion almost. And I think sometimes everyone's traumatized by their left elbow these days. It's getting a little bit much. But, because I'm not particularly woke, I'm not particularly sensitive, politically correct. And there's Californian trauma and there's Ukrainian trauma, But it's, I think in a way that's a better problem to have than the previous problem, which was no one knew what it was and denied it. So it's awesome that people like, Gabor Mate or, there's so many great teachers out there. I've hosted a lot of them on conferences and things. And, there's a lot of great stuff out there that people can find out for free, now.
One of the big things I'm taking away from this conversation is, and maybe this is just where I've been poised recently, is the nervous system, just the regulation of the nervous system. Because obviously I've noticed in myself that that's where my state does generally just start to relax into a more comfortable being, but then also gives me an opportunity, if I am to pick up on anything that is going to be a trait that could be worked with. It's probably going to be in that really relaxed, chilled out, sort of down-regulated sort of nervous system space. Is that a safe takeaway from this conversation? Would you feel comfortable with me taking that away from the conversation?
Yeah. I'd want to add something to it. So it's not a bad one. Like, we live in a stress world, so most of us, including me, need to down-regulate a lot.
Yeah.
However, there are people who need to up-regulate. There's people who need to, actually find themselves more excited, more expressive, more alive. There's different ways to do that. The other thing is embodiment certainly takes into account the nervous system, and like people like Stephen Porges, people can look at, do great stuff on the nervous system, polyvagal theory, great guy. And Deb Stainer, who he works with, is also a very good teacher. So it's a great thing to know about. But there's also the hormonal system. All right, like slower burn, longer, that's out there, full of adrenaline or whatever, testosterone, whatever. And then we could say fascial system, like how we're actually held together. That's the embodiment piece. So everyone's focusing on nervous system because it sounds scientific, and you put up a slide with a brain on with a blob of color on, and people believe anything you say. But there's actually a bit more to it than that, a bit more in depth. But I think there's a place to start for people, just becoming aware of their state if you're running anxious or scared or aggressive, and then saying, hey, do I want to stay in this for my own well-being, and do I want to transmit this to others? Maybe not.
I love that.
Awareness and choice.
One of the interesting things, and I promise I'll let you go at some point, but I'm just loving this conversation. I know it's getting late for you, but I'm just enjoying myself, bro. You signed up for this. You made this interesting comment at some point about, mindfulness is definitely spreading, and it's been awesome. And I'm in awe of the fact that it's actually become more and more mainstream people. I can have conversations with people that I've always wanted to have. And I can only imagine the evolution that you've witnessed, having been doing this work for so much longer. Like for me, it's been 6 years, and even 6 years ago was such a different territory now to what it is now. Having said that, there was this really important piece that I was like, you really got me stopping to reflect upon, was mindfulness and meditation is super helpful, but it doesn't, by virtue of itself, instill virtue within you.
Instill virtue
within you. Yeah. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I found that really interesting. It's paused me to reflect a lot.
Well, mindfulness could make you a better sniper or a better pickup artist or something else, right? Like, their actual context where
people don't talk about that, bro. Expand on that.
So I was at an event with some of the big tech companies in the world, a big conference. And I put my hand up, asked a question. I said, are we just putting knives into the hands of dangerous children? Like any tool can be used or misused, right? So that's one way of looking at mindfulness. But it's also, from a traditional Buddhist point of view, I'm trained to Theravada Buddhist, monastic stays and fairly long retreats and things. Actually, ethics is intertwined with mindfulness. It's just not normally taught that way in the modern context. Right. It's taught as this sort of consumer panacea. And modern life is sending us crazy. And then it's like, oh, go do yoga, go do mindfulness. That's the solution. And that's the Band-Aid for a gaping wound, I would say. Yeah. So I think we have a problem with making sure the kind of ethical side of it, and mindfulness is taught at a deeper level where there is an ethical integration. So just to give an example of how that might work, if I'm more aware of my body, I'm more aware if I do harm to someone, it will feel bad to me. Right? So that naturally brings out like, hey, I don't want to feel crappy, so I'm not going to turn crappy to you. Yeah. So ethics can come from mindfulness just naturally, though I think there is still this risk of it just simply being used and misused. And the second piece there is let's look at the wider context here. Yeah. Mindfulness, yoga, these personal growth tools, and I meditate every single day. That's a core practice for me every morning. However, there is a big context, and nature, community, there's other pieces there.
Yeah. Man, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing yourself so abundantly with us. I really appreciate the conversation we've had, and I know
I love it.
The audience will have taken away a lot. Especially, this conversation around state and trait and just how we carry ourselves, and also just the invitation to sort of soften around all of that, man. Like and especially this embodied leadership as the conversation, I think is really, really, really timely. And obviously you've been doing this for a long time, so I can't just thank you for today's conversation. I'm going to thank you for all the life's work that you put into this conversation that we get to bask on.
Well, yes, there's also elders in this field. I mentioned Paul Linden, one of my teachers. There's, people that have been doing this longer than me. So if people didn't like my style or they don't like my voice or attitude, there's so many women teachers out there. Do not worry about it if you don't like me. Like, there's so much good stuff out there that I can point people to, and get Googling, get looking out there. There's a whole world of embodied learning for people who want it.
And I'm sure many of you did love Mark's style, so links to all of his offerings in the show notes below as well. So please do go check them out. Mark, on behalf of myself and the Inspired Evolution Tribe, thank you so much for tuning in. Appreciate you so much. We're wishing you all the best, mate. Thank you again.
Thank you, Amrit. Total pleasure.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, leave us a comment. And if you want to stay in tune for new episodes launching every Monday, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay inspired to evolve.